So today is a little bit different. The focus is the coming of age ceremony and not the sermon, so I will try and do what ministers don't do well. Just be brief. I want to talk to you a little bit today about the process that our young people have gone through in developing their credos. It's been described in a little bit of detail, but basically over the course of this year, coming of age, when many would have a confirmation or a bar or bat mitzvah, they've joined with their advisors, parents, ministers, staff, in a year of reflection and learning together about Unitarian Universalism. They've studied Unitarian Universalist history and theology. They've talked about death, what a meaningful life looks like. They've written their credos, and in just a few weeks, many of the students will come to Boston with me and with some advisors and another coming-of-age group from Denton that will be joining us this year. And we'll look through the historical sites of our faith and our country, which are often intertwined in Boston. We'll stand in Arlington Street Church, which is the first church I ever had a job in. We'll stand in the pulpit where you can see the statue of William Ellery Channing. He was a short man, but his statue is raised up on a pulpit, so you can see him through the door on Boston Common in the public gardens looking at you in the pulpit. This was a church where drafts of the Constitution were ratified. This was the church of the founder of American Unitarianism, William Ellery Channing, and our ancestors. We'll go to Harvard Divinity School and stand together in Emerson Chapel in the exact spot and pulpit where Ralph Waldo Emerson preached his famous Divinity School address, where he said the job of becoming a Unitarian minister is not to convince people that there was something holy that happened 2,000 years ago, but that the falling rain and growing clover were divine right now. He said, acquaint yourself at first hand with deity. He was disinvited from Harvard for almost 20 years for doing that. He didn't make a lot of friends during that period, but we'll stand in that exact spot. I don't know if everyone is as much of a church and UU history nerd as I am, but there's something really cool about standing in the exact spot where our family tree diverged and the nature of Unitarian Universalism was formed right then and there. But the formative act that they've engaged in this year is writing their credos. The credo, while we don't have a creed, comes from the Latin word meaning I set my heart to. So what they've done is a thoughtful reflection on telling us what kind of values they want to help discern to guide their lives. Now, this is not an elevator speech about what Unitarian Universalism is. Saying what you believe and saying what Unitarian Universalism are different things, but people often confuse the two. What we've asked is that these individual students told us, these are the values that are worthy of my life's attention and service. This is a difficult thing to do. We don't ask our adult members of this congregation to do this all too regularly. We should, but we don't. I know that before I got here, we did have a class called Coming of Middle Age, COMA, for those of you who were paying attention. But I don't think we regularly ask our adult members to do this. This is hard. And a few of the young people in their credos, which we'll hand out at the end of the service, and you'll get to take them home and read them, a lot of them admitted this was harder than I thought it was going to be. So we've asked them to do this really difficult thing of writing down, setting with pen and paper, or a computer, I'm guessing, for most of them. These are the things that are most important to my life, and at the same time knowing that they might change, that they will change. Think of the courage that it takes to set these kind of things down in words and then give them to 500 people to look over. Yeah? My wife Kate and I recently bought a house here in Dallas, and we're going through boxes of things we haven't seen in a long time, and last week I opened up a box and found a collection of my poetry from my freshman year of high school. I was too embarrassed to read this alone. I cannot imagine giving them to the church, and the reason that I would have been mortified is because the words on the page were about 4% as insightful as the words that these students have written in their credos. Really, it's amazing. I hope you take the time to sit and read what they've accomplished. As one of your resident theologians, and as the minister to these young people and their families, what I want to do today is briefly hold up for you the theological themes that came out of their writing. Now, some of them I'm sure knew that they were touching on these themes. Maybe some of them didn't, but these things showed up. Ancient theological themes showing up in our church today and in our young people, and I'll briefly respond to what I heard from your credos as well. The first thing I heard over and over again from our young people was the question, how can I ever be sure? How do I know what I know? Can I trust my experiences and my senses and what I've been told? If we were in a philosophy class, we'd call this the epistemology section. How do I know what I know? The students also touched on a common theme, which was, what is the nature of God? They asked questions, if God is all-powerful and all-good, why do people in the world suffer? Why is there the kind of violence that we heard about this morning in our first Sunday collection if what we're taught about God is God's goodness? They asked, is God a person? An abstract reality that moves throughout the world? And each of them had a slightly different take on this. Some of them asked and came up with universalist arguments. At least one student said, we're just finite people. How could we ever be punished infinitely? Which is what Hosea Ballou, the great universalist theologian of the early 1800s, came up with. Another big theological theme that they came to over and over again was the question, are we good or not? And I think they were mixed. They trended toward the side of we're good. But they asked questions, if we're born good, why do we make mistakes? If we're deserving of love, why is it that we hurt others? Most of them came to the conclusion that we are born innately good, and that even in the worst of our mistakes, that good is still present. I think the things that hit me most poignantly, though, were two themes that came up over and over again. One was wondering why we can't control parts of ourselves. A couple of the students wrote and asked, why is it that there's a part of me that doesn't seem to listen to reason? Yeah? By your reaction, I'm guessing, like me, you know this is not only a teenage concern. One of the students reflected in her credo over and over again, how is it that I can know something to be true through logic and reason and then not act that way? Why do I hold on to these beliefs and desires about the world that don't seem to follow any logic or reason, but I want them to be the case so badly? And they talked about our limits, both the mistakes that we seem to make over and over again as human beings and the ultimate limit of our death. It was interesting to watch them reflect in what they wrote about whether or not our biggest mistakes can erase our goodness, how we control the parts of ourselves that we want to be different, and how many of them wrote that they weren't entirely sure what happens after they die, but so many of them said out loud that they so hoped that death wouldn't be the end, that they didn't want the goodbyes that we say to each other on this earth to be final goodbyes. These are the things that our coming-of-age students were reflecting on this year and in their credos. I found it interesting that some of them came up with the exact same answers that some pretty significant theologians and philosophers have. One of our students wrote that everyone ends up having faith in something, whether it's God or humanity. The options are money or state or science, sex or power or prestige. We all put our ultimate loyalty to something. That's what James Luther Adams said, the Unitarian theologian. One of the young women came up with the same answer that Aristotle did in his Nicomachean Ethics. She said, I want the goal for my life not to be just doing good, but loving what is good, so that the conflict between what I'm called to do and what I want to do is not so great. These themes came up over and over again, and in response to what you wrote, I want to tell you a few things. The first is that I'm really proud of the thoughtful reflection that you put into this. You were dealing with words like prayer and God and salvation and humanity and heaven and hell that can often be really abstract. And I hope that what you never fall into is the trap of being a religious literalist. Do you know what I mean by that? So it means believing that only one conception of a word or a story is true. There are people that think that one story in the Bible has to be totally, literally true for it to have any meaning, or they have to throw it away. And there are people on the other end which think that if it's not entirely, literally true, they don't want to have anything to do with it. Both of those sides are unhealthy spiritual paths. What happens if you become a religious literalist is you think that if prayer doesn't mean what it did to you when you were 7, that you're never supposed to pray again. Or that because somebody described an angry or a vengeful God to you when you were 10, it means that the concept of God is worthy of throwing out. Those things are not the case. But if you find yourself in those rigid, literal spaces, I promise you that your reflection and your vision is going to get confined, and you're going to be reactive and angry almost all the time in religion, just waiting for that word you don't agree with to show up. Please always allow mystery and humility to be a part of what you do. Also, I want to point out that the kind of things that you were wrestling with and struggling with are entirely normal, universal, ancient human questions. I promise you that the people sitting next to you in the pews today and your parents and grandparents probably haven't finished reflecting on why they can't seem to control parts of their lives, or the sadness that comes with reflecting on what it means to say goodbye to somebody when they die. The good news is what you're wrestling with is entirely normal. The bad news is these questions really aren't going to go away. Now, I can tell you, I'm not all that much older than you are, and some of these questions soften as you age. Some things seem less important or less reactive. You start to become more comfortable and loving toward yourself. Those things do change, and it gets better in that way. But you're never going to have to stop reflecting on what you want to give back to this life. I heard a lot of you reflect on what it means to die and whether or not something happens afterward. And as your minister, I have to say with honesty, standing in these pulpits today, that I really don't know. I've never been dead that I know of. And I can't tell you with 100% certainty what it looks like when we die. But I know for sure that how you live and who you love and how you love and whether or not you worship money or service makes a difference. That the world will tell you that money and power are the things that are most important, and I can promise you they are not. I can also promise you that the biggest mistake you ever make, and you will make some big ones, will never erase all of the good that you are and that you can do. And that means whether or not you find yourself ending up in jail or having hurt someone, these are concerns that don't fall outside of our congregation. We're real human beings with real frailties, and none of us has a totally different genetic makeup than every other human being. We should not be egotistical about that. Even the biggest mistakes you ever make will not erase the good that you're capable of doing. For the rest of your life, you're going to struggle with the part of you that looks like reason and the part of you that will not listen to that part of you that looks like reason. And reason is something that we almost worship in this religion. Reason's a good thing, but it will not solve all your problems. Knowing the science behind addiction doesn't mean that you're not going to struggle at some point with something that you can't give up in your life. I promise you. Knowing the science behind grief will not keep you from weeping over the grave of someone that you love. I promise. Knowing the facts will help, but you have to learn to respond with compassion to the parts of you that don't care about the facts. And I will say one thing that I hope for you in your spiritual maturity, which is this, and this is something that our adult members struggle with a lot here, I can promise you that, is being able to admit that you need to grow and change and still respond without shame. To know that at all points of your life, whether you're 15 or 85 or 96, that you have growth to do, that you make mistakes, that you fall short of the mark, that you're going to write these words in a credo and you're not going to live up to them some days. To learn to be able to honestly admit that and to respond with compassion toward yourself and others is one of the most freeing spiritual things you can ever do. Now, it might have been a little bit of a challenge or seemed boring or seemed like we were forcing work on you to do this credo this year, but I can tell you that it's worth it. I wish someone had helped me when I was your age to do this. When I was 15, there were a lot of pieces of my life that were absolutely falling apart, and I had no idea how to put those pieces together. My parents had gotten divorced. I had lost all faith in the God that I grew up with as a child. Someone that I loved dearly was killed in an act of violence, and my response was to throw everything out. My conceptions of school and family and God and church, all of that, I thought I had to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I wish someone had set me down and helped me understand what was actually worthy of trust in my life. It would have saved a lot of time and a lot of trouble, I can promise you that. This is a worthwhile process for everybody in the room. This is the time when I'm not just talking to you all. I'm sorry to kind of just focus for a minute. But this is a worthwhile endeavor. No one asks us to do this. Your job rarely asks you to sit down with pen and paper and say, these are the things that are worthy of the love of my life. Most of our culture will not ask you to do that. Most of our political parties will not ask us to do this, and it is the rarest of family systems or friends that ask us to do this, although I've seen them. I promise that if you sit down and reflect and write piece by piece, I set my heart to justice. Love is worthy of my life's attention. Compassion asks something of me. If you know your own list and why and how, it will change your life. It's almost like a talking mirror that speaks back in your voice, and you revisit that year after year, and it says to you, you said this was the type of life you wanted to live. How are you doing? It's a hard thing to do, and most of us don't do it because it's very difficult. But it's worthwhile, and I'm glad that you did. I want to welcome all of you into this next phase of your life in the church. I'll encourage you to join as members of our congregation. I learned from you something important when I read your credos. One is I was convinced once again of just how capable and kind and intelligent and thoughtful all of you are, what good and decent human beings you are and will be. And the other thing that stood out to me, that you pointed out to me again, is to remember that every single person in this room, every single person you meet from the checkout counter or the bank or your doctor's office or your siblings is struggling with some silent, secret battle. Everyone in this room is deathly afraid of something, worried that everyone else will find out they have no idea what they're actually doing. Struggling with some form of addiction or grief. Everybody. And you've reminded me that one of our primary calls in religion is to treat each person that we encounter with dignity, compassion, and kindness. And for that, I offer you my thanks. May this church be as good to you as it has been to me over your next few years here. We wish you all the best and welcome. Amen.